This episode of Creep Street Podcast is brought to you by Martini Coffee Roasters. Martini Coffee Roasters is not a martini-flavored coffee. In fact, it is a family-owned and operated company run by the Martini family. And while I'm sure they enjoy a good cocktail, they are all about that high-quality, smooth, flavorful coffee. Unlike many other roasters, Martini Coffee Roasters roast manually using a traditional method of roasting, most relying on sight and sound to ensure the best results, okay? This is quality, people. This is artisanal. This is handmade. This is what you're wanting. And not only that, but they also sell green coffee beans for those home roasters out there. So please support small businesses and check out Martini Coffee Roasters at martinicoffee.com. Once again, check out Martini Coffee Roasters at martinicoffee.com.
You've taken a wrong turn down Creep Street.
Citizens of the Milky Way, I'm Maureen Bogey.
And this is Dylan Hackworth.
And you are listening to the Creep Street, a podcast.
That's
Thank
right.
you guys so much for joining us. We have a great episode for you all today. Before we get started, we're on Instagram at Creep Street Podcast, on Twitter at Creep Street Pod. We are also on Facebook, and we have a subgroup within our Facebook called Citizens of the Milky Way.
Yes.
Feel free to check that out. Just click up at the top of the page to be accepted. And we'll let you in. So if you're looking to support the podcast, please like, rate, subscribe, post it on one of these social medias, tell a friend. It really, really does make a huge difference.
That's right.
And also, we have a Patreon.
That's right.
Where we have 3 different tiers, and each tier gives you some great bonus Creep Street content.
Oh, yeah.
And speaking of the tiers, Dylan, will you please read our top tier donors today?
God, I love it. I love this every week. It's like reading poetry. Of course, the dream, James Watkins. The Finnish face via a Lungfist. The madman, Marcus Hall. The vivacious Vicky McHugh. The tenacious Teresa Hackworth. The heartbreak kid, Chris Hackworth. The oh-so-suave, Sean Richardson. The British bone breaker, Bex Martin. The notorious Nicholas Barker. The terrifying Taylor Lashmet. The Count of Cool, Cameron Corliss. And the Archduke of Attitude, Adam Archer.
You know, Dylan, you know I love those names, and you
That's
read
right.
them off so well.
That's right.
If you're interested in being a Patreon donor, like those cool cats, feel free to head on over to patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast for more info.
That's right. That's right.
Now, Dylan, love is in the air.
It is. It is. This will come out, on the 12th, I think? And Valentine's Day is on the 14th. So
It is every year, guys. Remember that. That's a little Creep Street life hack. February 14th is Valentine's Day always.
That's right. And happy Valentine's Day to all the lovers out there. Whether you're single or not, it doesn't matter. If you're single, love yourself or whoever's
or
buying.
the podcast.
Love the podcast. You're our Valentine.
Yes.
You are all our Valentines. Let's get right to it. Because some people said they wanted to wait to listen to part 1 till part 2
Until
came.
part 2, which I get.
Today is volume 2 of the Bridgeport Poltergeist.
Ooh, and if you haven't gone back to listen to Volume 1, we strongly suggest you listen to that Volume 1 before you give it a Volume 2. But you know what? If you give it a Volume 2 and then you give it a Volume 1, that's you, I guess.
That's right. Once again, even though I stated it last time, my source is The World's Most Haunted House, The True Story of the Bridgeport Poltergeist on Lindley Street by William J. Hall. Let's get into it.
Okay.
So when we last left off, shit was going wild. Someone was saying the cat was talking, crucifixes are flying off the ground.
Knives are being thrown by an invisible force.
Yes, and a woman named Mary Pasquarelli, she was the last person to enter the house. She was a friend of theirs, and she obviously knew something was up. And where we left off was when Mary decided to put in a call to some friends of hers, Ed and Lorraine Warren.
Hello.
Happy Valentine's Day.
There they are, baby.
So where we left off, it was about 11 a.m. on Sunday, November 24th, 1974. So this is still hell weekend at the time.
Oh my God.
Now, what's so wild about this story, and I was telling Mo about this, is the bulk of the horror happens in a short amount of time. There's just so much shit that happens. We had to break this into two. Really, the bulk of this story is really a stretch of like a week. So how Mary knew the Warrens, she attended one of their lectures and met them that way, had their contact info. Well, she called him at their house in Monroe, Connecticut. Ed answered, and Mary explained the situation to him, what was going on at the Goodens home. So Ed left immediately for the Goodens right away. Lorraine stayed behind and waited for Father Bill Carbonell. That we'll just call him Father Bill because that's just easier. He often would accompany the Warrens, so Lorraine called him. Ed went first. Father came over to meet Lorraine. So it wasn't hard for Ed to find the Goodens home because by now there were crowds stacked up for blocks on either side of the house. Ed went in, introduced himself to Jerry. Jerry wasn't aware who the Warrens were, but the Hoffmans, their friends, explained who they were, so made him feel more at ease.
They were like, listen, these are pretty cool guys.
Yeah. So Ed Warren gets out his tape recorder, starts interviewing all the eyewitnesses, all the police, and his tape gets filled up pretty quickly. So he heads back home to brief Lorraine and Father Bill on what was going on. At the same time, 21-year-old seminary student Paul Eno was driving to Ed and Lorraine's Warren's house, looking forward to a nice, quiet dinner with friends.
Oh, no.
You see, he became a friend of the Warrens recently when they reached out to him about an article he wrote about the paranormal. So Paul pulled up at the Warrens' house right as Ed was pulling up as well. He gets out of the car, doesn't even have a chance to say hello. Lorraine asks him, "Paul, are you in a highly spiritual state right now?" "I guess so. What's up?" "We'll fill you in on the way." Once Father Bill arrived, they all got in the Warrens' car and headed over.
Man, this guy thought he was coming over for a free meal.
Yeah.
He arrives and they say, "Sir, you're gonna work."
"We're going to work, sir."
"We're going back to work."
When they got there, everyone introduced everyone to the Warrens and whatnot. Jerry played the Warrens the tape of that banging noise that him and Officer Hallsworth recorded back in 1972. Laura returned now from the hospital as well. Remember, at the end of last episode, she was going to the hospital because of that TV, remember?
That's right. It fell on her foot, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And 2 of her toes were hurt. One was broken. Not like life-serious injury, but, hey.
A huge pain in the ass.
Broken toe.
An actual, injury, but
certainly doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
Laura was happy, though, to see her family and happy to get back home. Now, the book says that at this moment, she actually seemed cheerful. Just having the house crowded with people gave her a sense of comfort. Just simple strength in numbers.
No, I totally get that.
So now Ed Warren took Paul aside and had a chat with him. Ed was making it Paul's job to keep an eye on Marcy at all times, the daughter.
Right.
And this is what Ed said to Paul.
"It's common in hoax cases for the child to be the perpetrator, and it's also frequently a contributor in legitimate paranormal cases. Children are great imitators, and they quickly learn that once the chaos quiets down, people leave. One way to get them to stay is to help things along."
Now, just to clarify, Ed is not saying he thinks that Marcy's behind it.
Right.
What he's saying is sometimes, because obviously you're not in control of when this thing does it. So if you're wanting to show, you might be tempted as a child to do something. So he's saying, hey, make sure Marcy doesn't do any of that because this is a legitimate haunting. And if she does that, it's all done.
Then no one's going to be...
Because then it's all, you're
that
right.
actually happened in The Conjuring too. So either, because he's not saying she for sure lied or is making this up. He's saying either this is true and we need to keep an eye on her to make sure she doesn't fake something else because she's so badly wants this to be addressed. We also want to keep an eye on her because more paranormal activity usually revolves around children anyway.
Exactly.
And then also watch out for her in case this whole thing is,
because if someone
sometimes kids do lie.
Because if someone who's, not the family or not the Warrens, if they see her do something, if one of the cops say, then it's all done.
Yeah.
Even though they've seen legitimate shit flying around, the second they know something was, then it's all
then they'll
tarnished.
say it's all fake.
So Paul went looking for Marcy. He found her in the basement. She was holding her pet cat, Sam, and 2 of the police officers were down there and they were chatting with her. And one of the sources says apparently they were trying to get her to admit she was behind everything.
Of course.
So Paul quickly stepped in and introduced himself to the officers politely, but to cut them off.
Hello, my name is
Paul.
Father Paul. I am hungry.
Which, by the way, a 10-year, I don't know how old she was when this happened, but it's like she should not be alone with the cops.
I know that's very, but yeah.
That's just not how it works.
The
You don't
past
leave
was stupid.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't long until the action began to pick back up.
Oh.
There came a rattling noise from the master bedroom. A group of them went to go check it out. Jerry's brother Edmund, he was part of this group, and he was standing in the doorway of the master bedroom. And after a moment, something on the wall, a movement, catches his eye. And on the wall was this large crucifix. And they watched as it removed itself from the wall and slowly floated down to rest on the floor by Laura and Jerry's bed.
Wow, you usually hear about things kind of falling.
Right.
So the fact that it had the control to slowly put something down, that's very strange.
So Lieutenant Coco, he told Ed Warren, he was one of the officers there. I don't go,
we love Lieutenant Coco.
He told Ed Warren to call Superintendent Joseph Walsh, who was their boss, and explain to him what was going on, because obviously Ed would probably be the best to explain the whole Poltergeist thing.
So Coco's hitting up Walsh.
Ed Warren calls Walsh, explains it to him. Walsh kind of laughs it off and just says, well, whatever it is, just tell him to wrap it up.
Oh my God.
So a bit later, everyone's in the living room. Everyone's having a million conversations at once. Marcy's sitting in one of the recliners just watching the crowds of people. All of a sudden, the room fell silent. All the eyes were on Marcy. The recliner she was in was floating off of the floor. Everyone watched in silent dread as it went higher and higher. And as it got to the ceiling, it suddenly somersaulted a complete 360 degrees, throwing poor Marcy to the floor. She landed on her head hard.
Oh, God.
The chair also comes crashing down on an end table.
Thank God it didn't fall on her.
Thank God it didn't fall on her, because this is a very heavy recliner. Laura grabbed up Marcy and was comforting her. So by now, there's rarely a quiet moment in the house.
Right.
Something is always happening. The pounding was back, and it wouldn't go away for longer than an hour. As we know, tables and chairs just kept flipping over. A light bulb in one of the lamps just blew up. Ed Warren was standing in the kitchen and watched a bunch of knives just spin around on the floor.
Oh my God, this is really wild.
Yes. Now, when Jerry's prized ashtray that Marcy and Laura had gotten him for his birthday got smashed, Jerry f***ing lost it.
You can literally give my daughter a massive head injury, lift her up to the ceiling, flip her upside goddamn down. But if you touch my fucking ashtray, I will break your dick. That's an exact quote.
Exact quote
from Jerry. An
exact
quote from Jerry. Word for word.
Jerry storms out of the room, and when he came back, he was carrying an old coffee jar filled with holy water.
Oh, where was this? And why is it in an old coffee jar?
He starts dipping his hand in and just shaking the water everywhere. All of a sudden, there were 3 distinct knocks at the door. Knock, knock, knock. Jerry went to the door, opened it, and of course, no one's there. At that same time, the tulip lamps in the living room began to rattle, and one of their guests entered the living room at that time saying that the rosary beads hanging in Marcy's room were moving around and tapping the wall. The wooden chimes in the hallway began to jingle. The whole house started to come alive. It was almost like a low, like before an eruption, like the rumbling.
Yeah. Oh my God, this is so scary.
So their friend Barbara, who was there, decided she was going to make some coffee.
Well, I'm sure she saw that coffee jar and she was like, that's an idea.
Absolutely. So Ed, Barbara, and little Marcy went to the kitchen, and she helped them, with the coffee and everything. They didn't want to be in the kitchen long, obviously. So they came out to let everyone know that the coffee was ready, and right on cue, there came a loud crash from the kitchen.
Oh, God.
They went back to find that the table had flipped and all the coffee and mugs were just thrown everywhere. Well, by now, the entire house had been looked over by professionals, so they knew it wasn't rigged up to do that. As a last-ditch hope for a reasonable answer, they summoned an electrician and a plumber to just make sure everything was good. Now, before entering, the police had a word with them, filling them in on what was going on. So the men entered, and they could tell right away the place was just wrecked. They just kind of looked at each other and shrugged it off. They went about their business and checked everything. When they were in the kitchen, they saw the fridge lift once again off the ground, float about 6 to 8 inches, and then gently set back down again.
It's like it's showing off. It's just trying to be like, hey.
And that was when one of the officers escorted the gentleman to the door, saying,
"Leave now and keep your mouth shut about what you just saw. This is a police matter."
It's kind of mean.
So now it's about 2 p.m. The activity seemed to be taking a break, so the police officers decided to head out themselves. They said their goodbyes to the family and stressed if anything else happened to just report it, and they'd be there. So they leave, but Officer Tomek hung back, saying he had to go back in to get something from the house. You see, Tomek's eyes had been opened today by all the weird shit that was going on. He was convinced that there was a presence in the house, and that it had something to do with Marcy. So Tomek went back inside the house. And the Goodens and the Warrens, they were all in the kitchen, in conversation. He had an idea. So Tomek went to Marcy's room, and not saying anything, he just thought it to himself. He thought,
"If you can hear me, move something."
Almost immediately, there was action.
Wow.
Items on the wall began to shake, like a baby picture, a cross, some decorative cherubs. Also, he noticed that the items were shaking, not the wall they were on.
Right.
So it wasn't like this was the foundation trembling or something.
It was
like
truly
that.
just certain objects were moving.
Tomek was pretty convinced he was getting a direct answer. So once again, he thought to himself,
"Okay, you can stop now."
and the items stopped moving.
So this man is a medium.
I guess. Just a few hours ago, he didn't believe in any of this shit.
Yeah, wow.
So Tomek believed he had just had direct communication with an entity or entities, but he also decided he would keep that to himself, and he never mentioned it in a single police report and never mentioned it to anyone for 40 years.
Oh, why?
Why? I don't know.
People, this stuff really affects people.
I guess he
it
was
really shakes them.
I guess he was afraid it would cost him his job or something if he put it in a police
Yeah.
report.
Ugh.
So now, it's about 4 p.m., and it's Sunday. Now, the crowd outside the Goodens had grown to over 2,000 people.
Oh my God.
News trucks and reporters were there now. Additional police and police dogs had been called to keep the crowds at bay. The story was now a national news story. The Warrens and Father Bill, they said goodbye to the Goodens and told them that whenever the activity started in one room, to just go immediately to another room. And they also stressed, Ed told them, when something moved, so say a picture fell,
Right.
let it lay where it was. The reason why is sometimes clues about their identity or what's going on can be left in how things are. It might seem like chaos, but there
Right.
might actually be a method to the madness. It
Right.
might be trying to communicate.
Totally.
They exited through the masses and made their way home. People who were closest to the house in the crowd, they were actually able to see things in the house moving around.
Oh, so even the crowd could see. Oh,
Yes.
That's bizarre.
And some say there was these two decorative cement swans that were on the outside of the door, and a group of people said that the swans turned and looked at each other. And some even said they heard a demonic voice that seemed to be coming from the swans.
From the swans?
Yeah.
Swans are dicks.
So Ed and Lorraine Warren returned the next morning at about 8 a.m., and they were accompanied by Paul and Father Bill. Now, and this is 8 a.m., and already there's crowds and reporters outside the house. Neighbors had also been bringing by tons and tons of food as a show of support.
Oh, that's nice.
Very few reporters were actually granted access to the home, and letting any in at all might have been a mistake, too.
Yeah,
But,
they shouldn't have done that.
One of the reports noticed a book in the family's living room. It was a Russian Orthodox prayer book written in both English and Old Church Slavonic. A reporter would use this book as fodder to say that Marcy and the Goodens were into the occult.
What?
And that little Marcy was always walking around with a stack of strange books, when in reality, this prayer book was actually Paul's, the seminary student. It was gifted to him by an Orthodox priest in Canada who was once a monk from the Middle East. So the press took this odd-looking book and just ran with it.
When really it was just the hungry priest's book. He probably left his book there because he wanted a piece of pizza so bad he
Right.
forgot that he left his book.
So now this is in the mix, the whole occult thing, which is what they didn't want.
Which is even if that book was in their house, it's how many books do you have in your house? You know what I mean? Everyone just has random books. You're like, I don't, it's that doesn't really mean anything.
Exactly. So like Ed had mentioned before, there were times when Marcy would do something and sort of act like it was the ghost. The book mentions there was an example where one time Marcy reclined back quickly in her chair and gave a big look like it was the entity that had done it, but Laura quickly told her, don't do that crap.
Yeah.
Thank God when she did do it, there were no reporters inside.
I mean, you gotta give Cutter a little slack,
Exactly.
You gotta have a little fun.
Now, if you'll remember, at the end of Volume 1, we were introduced to Marcy's pet, Sam, the cat.
I do remember.
And apparently one of these cops was claiming that he heard the cat speak.
Yeah, Sam, explain yourself.
Let's
literally.
talk about Sam here. The family had Sam for a while, but things started getting weird with him only a month before. Sam had been taken to the vet for a surgery. The source doesn't specify what kind of surgery, but apparently after it was done, Jerry had told his friends that it seemed like Sam sometimes was acting bizarre, almost like he was trying to talk.
Whoa.
Now, to be clear, Jerry never once said that Sam talked.
Right.
Just that it was funny. I bet in his mind, he's just saying, oh, it's fine. It's like he's trying to talk.
Yeah, he's like, my cat is,
But sometimes he would hear a voice coming from a room with no one in it except for Sam the cat.
Oh my God, this is so scary and cute all at the same time.
In fact, there were 3 distinct voices that seemed to emanate from the cat, Jerry said.
What?
Jerry said it could both sing and swear like a sailor. Sam liked to hang out in the basement. Every now and then, someone would shut the basement door. Sam would get locked in for a bit. It happened, not forever, just for a little bit. Jerry said once he could hear Sam kicking the basement door, shouting,
"Let me out, you dirty Frenchman, you dirty Greek."
Now,
was he of Greek or French descent? Do we know?
I don't know, but apologies, of course. Well, I guess Jerry was part French-Canadian or something like that. But just apologies, of course, to our French-Greek listeners. We obviously do not hold the same views as Sam the cat.
We here at Creep Street firmly stand against the heinous words used by this cat. Crazy. So he had heard that before, but he didn't actually
mention that.
See Sam doing it.
That's weird. Like, how does that?
I mean, who else is what else is that voice from? Yeah.
It's not like you thought you heard the cat say hi.
Right. Yeah. What was this cat's experience with the French and the Greek?
I don't know.
But also, so then it's like, is this a ghost? Is this like a living, spirit inside the cat? A lot of questions are really cracked open because of this cat.
So the Warrens and Father Bill had been there for only about 30 minutes that morning when the activity started going. And it started easy, slowly. The curtain rod in the bathroom fell down despite no one being in there. Lorraine went to go to Marcy's room but was overcome with nausea when she did and quickly left the room. So now the Warrens and Father Bill are chatting with Marcy in the basement. They're very curious about this cat, Sam. Father Bill, right away, was able to tell a lot about Marcy, and he knew that she was a very insecure child. He could just tell right away. Marcy explained how much she loved Sam the cat because she finally had her first friend.
There actually is. I know there is. There's a series of books called Sam the Cat.
I'm sure, yeah.
So, shout out Sam the Cat. Feel free to pick it up at anywhere you buy books.
Father Bill immediately had an immense sense of empathy for the girl. He really felt bad for her. He's listening to her chat, and just then, the lights went out, and they're in the basement, of course. They're in complete darkness. Marcy was sitting on top of, when she was chatting with him, they had a big freezer in their basement. She was just sitting on that. The lights went out. Marcy got down. She opened the lid of the fridge. It gave her a little light. She went up the stairs, flipped the switch a few times till the light came back on. She headed back downstairs. She curiously walked over to a plastic tablecloth in one corner of the room where Jerry had a bunch of tools and stuff stacked. She peeked under the tablecloth and kind of returned to the group, and just a moment later, a metal rod shot out from under the tablecloth, heading directly for Father Bill. He was able to step out of the way, and he went over and he examined the table and the cloth for himself. He looked underneath, and there were more rods like the one that just shot at him, but there was nothing to launch it with.
Right.
I don't know if it was curtain rods or it just said metal rods. Yeah. Assuming curtain rods, but there was nothing to launch it that way.
What?
And little Marcy wasn't going to, and she wasn't near it when it did it. Just then Jerry was upstairs, and so he called to Marcy. He wanted to chat with her. So Marcy went upstairs, and the Warrens and Father Bill, they stayed with the cat, with Sam downstairs. They just kind of were chatting. They could hear Marcy and her dad chatting upstairs, and they were just chatting downstairs about all that was going on. All of a sudden, the Warrens and Father Bill started noticing that Sam was behaving weird. It was like he was afraid of something. His head and his eyes moved as if he was watching something move. And that's when they heard an awful, demonic voice say,
"Jingle bells."
They turn and look at Sam, and there's a loud squealing noise, like a voice squealing, and it seemed like it was coming from Sam, or at least in his direction. But this was not the sound an animal would make, not even an injured animal. Like most kids, Marcy was known to hold Sam up to her face and act like he was talking, the way kids do with cats or action figures, shit like that, But she was upstairs with her family, so clearly wasn't making this shit happen. Well, Ed was a little bummed out because he'd ran out of tapes to record stuff. What was so important about this, he wanted to record it to be able to tell if it was either a physical or a hallucinatory noise. So earlier, when they were able to catch the noise of the pounding, that might have been because the entity was employing a physical object to make the noise. Whereas maybe if it's contacting you via, it might, even though it might sound like a noise in the room, it might be hallucinatory, therefore wouldn't be on. So that way they're kind of able to judge.
And if something's hallucinatory, it doesn't mean it's quote unquote not real.
Not real.
It just means that it's just a different type.
Exactly. We talked about that, on our EVP episodes, how sometime one EVP recorder will catch something even though it was right next to another that didn't. It's almost like the entity specifically wanted that one. So now it's about 9 a.m. All three of the Goodens, Jerry, Laura, and Marcy, are in the kitchen. Lorraine was sitting in the kitchen. She was still a little nauseous, saying that it was worse, though, in Marcy's room. But the group then watched as a second-degree burn appeared and blistered on Lorraine's left hand near her wrist. Ed immediately wanted Lorraine to leave, but Lorraine convinced him she would be fine. Apparently, and the source says this, Ed was concerned with spontaneous combustion.
Wow.
Which I didn't know was a feared possibility of. He said because she's a clairvoyant, I guess he was afraid that there's a chance she could have burst into flames. I don't know. I don't know as much about that to understand why, but interesting.
Yeah, we have an episode on spontaneous human combustion.
Yes, Lisa Grant's requested episode.
Yes.
I think it was back in June. Yes, fun episode. Well, Paul had begun to notice the smell of sulfur in the air.
Hot tip for you guys, another Creep Street life hack.
Yeah.
That's bad.
It seemed to be coming from Marcy's room, and it wasn't long till everyone else noticed it too. So the day passes. It's about 10 p.m. Paul and Lorraine went to get sandwiches for everybody.
Paul is finally eating.
Now, the Goodens news story was going to air at 11 p.m. Father Bill and a friend of the family's named Linda Anderson were at the Goodens, and she would also sometimes babysit Marcy, it says, so that she was with the family and whatnot. She also was helping. They were keeping an eye on Marcy, too. She was helping Paul with that. Mostly just because of safety, too.
Absolutely.
Obviously, to make sure she doesn't do anything dumb, but also just make sure she doesn't get hurt, too, because whatever it was, it seemed to be directed at Marcy.
Totally, yeah.
So Marcy took them to her room and proudly showed off some of her toys and stuff. She had really started to warm up to everyone. And for the first time, people who were not her immediate family were treating her like a human being. Aww. Like, if you think about it, as we know, anyone who wasn't either her family or a friend of the treated her like shit. Even her teachers.
The kids at school were fucking dicks.
So for the first time, she's like, wow, here's people who aren't family who treat me nice.
That's so nice. Oh.
She led them to the kitchen, just chatting away. She showed them her charm bracelet.
Oh, very
things like
good.
that. The house wasn't that big. So, or even from the kitchen, Father Bill was actually able to see into Marcy's room and saw her dresser once again go flying and smash into the wall. Just then, flowers in the vase were moving without the vase moving. Paul felt a cold spot, too. He looked around the kitchen trying to find where the draft might be coming from. It seemed like it was coming from the TV, or at least in that area, but it wasn't like the whole kitchen was cold.
Right, yeah.
It was just in this one area. That's when the same TV that hurt Laura's foot fell forward, hitting Paul's leg, leaving a nice little gash on it.
This fucking TV.
I know. Nothing that, he had to get stitches, but
still.
Got his damn attention, probably didn't feel good.
Yeah, what the hell is going on?
And then at 11, they all gathered around and watched the news story. Marcy was getting a little bored and wanted to go play in her room, but Paul volunteered to watch Marcy. And as she played, and Goodens were cool with that. So Paul had been doing exactly what Ed asked him to do. He'd been keeping close watch of Marcy and had really grown fond of her. And she was very religiously dedicated, which, he's a seminary student.
So yeah, he's
into
that.
So he had mad respect. Game recognizes game.
That's right.
And he also sensed that whatever it was targeting Marcy. And he was very afraid that possession was a possibility.
Yeah.
So now it's 2 a.m.
I must be lonely.
Everyone's exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
The Warrens, along with Paul and Father Bill, headed out. They'd be back later that day just to check in on the good and see how they're doing. People were still outside. Sometimes now the crowd was even getting antagonistic, thinking the cops were covering up something.
A little bit of kind of an angry mob kind of vibe. Yeah, yikes.
So the Warrens got back home at their house in Monroe, Connecticut at about 3 a.m. Everyone's exhausted, but they're not in a place where they can just immediately go to sleep. So Ed and Father Bill settle in on a couch in the living room while Paul and Lorraine have some tea in the kitchen. Lorraine and Paul had been talking in the kitchen when they suddenly could feel a presence. Something was there with them. Lorraine and Paul immediately held hands and prayed, and they felt the presence leave immediately. After a little time, they were able to sleep, and they got some rest.
Oh, God. So this thing maybe followed them home or...
Right.
Oh, God.
So it's morning time, and already the police have barricades set up around the house, and they even had a paddy wagon parked out front just to send the message that, hey, we'll make arrests if necessary, folks. Yeah. Now that the story had ran on the news the night before, people were coming in from all over, not just the neighborhood. Everyone wanted a glimpse of this action.
The whole goddamn state of Connecticut's popping off.
Father Bill was up by 8 a.m. that day because he had to do mass in a nearby town, but as he was leaving the Warrens' house, their phone rang. Well, everyone else was asleep, of course. He had to get up early because of mass. Their phone rang, so he thought, well, I'll answer it for him because it might be the Goodens. And it was Laura Gooden. She said the activity was back and worse than ever.
Oh, no.
Father Bill did his best to assure her, and then he went and woke up the Warrens and Paul. So he went to do mass, and then the Warrens and Paul, they went over to the Goodens' house. Now the crowds are getting really rough. By this time, even with police there, people and reporters are sometimes entering without permission.
Oh my God.
And of course, the police will escort them out best they can, Both Ed and Father Bill, they believed an exorcism was desperately needed. But Monsignor John Toomey said that the church did not believe the cause of the activity to be supernatural. Now, there's a few complicated reasons for this. One, if the church were to officially declare this to be a legitimate paranormal situation, the crowds would just be out of control. Likewise, the church would receive a lot of scrutiny. Their hands were tied because their own parish said no, and it was against the rules to reach out to an outside priest to come in.
Yeah, you got to get Big Daddy's opinion now. You got to get Big Daddy's talking to the Pope.
Jerry went to work that morning at 6 a.m. like he usually did, and he got his own form of bullying.
Oh, fuck.
People were relentless at work, asking him how the ghosts were and if the cat had read them any good books lately. Things like that.
Good one.
There was a strong insinuation that it was all a hoax and that the Goodens only wanted attention. Jerry, on the outside, remained as composed as he could, defending himself against insults, but on the inside, he was just heartbroken.
Well, this fucking sucks.
Yeah. Ed and Lorraine chatted with Laura back at the Gooden home about the exorcism. Laura agreed it was probably necessary, but she also stressed to the Warrens that her and Jerry didn't believe in ghosts. They were religious, but they didn't believe that shit like...
Yeah, this was just completely different for them.
Exactly. And Ed and Lorraine Warren were determined to figure out how they could get approval for an exorcism.
Right.
So now, it's about 1 p.m. Paul left to get some snacks at a nearby convenience store. He picked up some hard candy for Lorraine because he knew she liked it.
Oh, that's nice.
Somehow, the press took this and spun it into some batshit story. The rumor that they spun was that Ed Warren had laced the candy with drugs so that they were all having hallucinations. That's what all this crazy stuff was.
Oh, my God.
There was even a rumor that Ed had drugged little Marcy and used witchcraft to give her powers.
It's like, why is that more believable than what they're saying is happening? This drives me fucking insane.
Now, obviously, now it was getting hard for people to discern the bullshit from the real stuff, as with all things. So Paul is now in the kitchen. He's offering the candy to folks, and he was resting with his hands on the back of the chair Marcy was sitting in. All of a sudden, he felt like an upward pressure. Something was lifting Marcy's chair off the floor, and he could feel the upward force. Paul used his hands to push the chair back down, and as it reached the floor, he felt the pressure release. Sort of almost like an arm wrestling competition.
Right.
Now, after this incident, everything went quiet for a few hours. But the crowd was getting worse, banging on the windows, shouting.
My God.
Laura called Jerry at work at 1:30 and asked that he come home, which he did.
Ugh.
Later, when Jerry got home, it had begun to rain outside. Marcia, Barbara, and Paul were in the living room on the floor playing some Monopoly. And that's when Jerry got that feeling again, the one he would get before the activity would start up. His body felt very heavy, like there was a weight on it. Suddenly, that weight was gone, but Jerry could see something move away from him and into Marcy's room. The way Jerry described it, he said it was like seeing a movement, but without seeing what moved.
Oh,
if that makes sense. He went to a room and looked around, and that's when he felt that heaviness again. Jerry went to the kitchen, sat down at the table. He was just overwhelmed. Buckle up, because this is where it hits the fan. Jerry sat there for about 15 minutes when he started to get that heavy feeling again. In the living room, the game of Monopoly was still going on, when somewhere in the house, Laura started crying. Immediately, Paul began to chant a prayer, and Marcy did the same thing. Jerry, at the same time, walks into the living room, this feeling that something big was about to happen. Whatever this entity was, it was about to reveal itself to them. In the living room, there was a large, yellowish-white, gauzy mist, and in the mist, they could see something taking shape. They could see through it, but could still see it was a figure. And then it began to morph into 4 separate figures. Jerry could smell what seemed like sulfur or ozone from a generator. Suddenly his mind was just flooded with thoughts. He couldn't understand them. They were just mind-boggling. And that's when Jerry began a Gregorian chant. Everyone looked at him in awe and in terror. Following the chant, Jerry began to say Mass entirely in Latin. Now, 40 years ago, Jerry was an altar boy, but he hadn't done anything like that since. Definitely nothing in Latin. And even as an altar boy, he never recited a whole Mass, just the responses. Well, it's about to get weirder. Jerry then chanted the Mass of the Dead, which is apparently done when adults die. And then he chanted the Mass of Angels, which is performed when a child dies, even offering responses to prayers in Latin. Everyone watched in horror. Laura was now in one of the recliners sobbing as she watched Jerry. With his hand, Jerry picked up the nearby jug of holy water, and as he did, the source says Jerry's voice lowered to a strange baritone, one the family was not used to. He walked back, sprinkling the holy water with his hand. 4 entities in the mist circled him, following him around as he walked from room to room, chanting and sprinkling the holy water. Paul was now praying from his prayer book, and Marcy was crying, clinging on to Paul's waist. The source says you could sense feeling of rage coming from Jerry.
Oh my God.
And that's when Paul realized the almost parasitic nature of these 4 entities. The closer they got to Jerry, the more enraged Jerry became. It was almost like they were feeding off of that energy. Paul gently pushed Marcy behind him so that he was blocking her from harm, and Paul watched as the entities grew stronger. All the while, he could feel his own anger building up inside of him, and he knew they were feeding off of that as well.
Oh, fuck.
One of the entities was floating by Paul to go past him, and just sort of out of an instinct, Paul kind of put up his arm as a way to keep it from going by. Much to his surprise, the entity seemed to intelligently push back, almost like when one person, like say you're at a crowded bar and someone walks by and bumps your shoulder. But when it did that, Paul was actually able to feel and determine specific characteristics. So like, for example, say there was an invisible person that pushed you. Even if you couldn't see them, you could probably be able to tell it was a human because of what you felt, the hands, the fingers. Well, what Paul felt did not feel human. The best he could describe it was something bony, almost like a bird.
Oh my, you guys, I don't like that.
He said he couldn't see it, but the closest thing he could imagine to feeling was like a bird, like a large bird with talons.
Oh, you guys, shut it down, you guys.
Obviously, Paul is terrified, as you'd expect, but he's also puzzled. And as we know, Paul has quite an extensive knowledge of the paranormal. And what he felt wasn't like any poltergeist he had heard of before.
No, not at all.
Nor was it like anything he had read about in demonology or his spiritual studies. The entities then picked up Marcy and threw her across the room. She ran back to Paul, crying, latching onto him, and they watched in horror as the 4 entities began to combine together, once again forming one large entity. It grew and grew. You could feel the rage permeating everything. The entity grew until it filled the whole house. Paul ordered everyone to get outside, and they all fled the home into the front yard.
God.
Now outside, it's late November, it's cold, it's rainy. But from the front yard, they can see shit getting thrown around inside. So everyone's fucking cold, of course.
Yeah.
Paul tells the Goodens to stay right where they are. He was going to run back into the house and call the Warrens. So he went to go back in the house. A dog leapt out of the shadows, barking and snarling, not at Paul, but at something.
A dog?
A dog. And it was running towards something when all of a sudden it yelped, turning and running back into the bushes with its tail between its legs. Paul, for whatever reason, felt like it was probably safer to run across the street and call the Warrens from a neighbor's house.
Yeah, when you see these animals that that weren't there, it's better safe than sorry.
So he rushes over to the neighbors. They let him in. Paul was about to make a call when suddenly there were 3 sharp knocks on the neighbor's door. The kid, the family's child, ran and answered the door and shouted back to his family,
"No one's there!"
Oh my God.
To which Paul said under his breath,
"You want to bet, kid?"
Come on.
So he calls the Warrens. The Warrens and Father Bill head right over. They get to the Goodens at about 9:15 p.m. Also there was Ted Hollinsworth, and Father Bill wastes no time getting started with the blessing. He went from room to room, praying, sprinkling the holy water. The Warrens followed behind him. They made their way to the basement, where Father Bill continued his prayers and sprinkling. And at one point, he nearly tripped over Sam the cat as he went walking by. And as he was reciting prayers, Father Bill noticed an out-of-place shadow on the wall. What was strange was, this was a basement. It was very dimly lit. It was already dark in there. But this shadow was darker than the dark. First, he dismissed it, but when he got another look, he realized it wasn't a shadow, but some sort of a shadow person. Father Bill pauses, and he asks the Warrens and Paul if they see it as well, and they did. But from where Ed was standing, he could start to make out a face, but not the face of a person. This face had nub-like horns protruding from its head. They agreed to not tell the Goodens at this time.
Wow.
Not for any nefarious reasons, but the Goodens already know there's a presence there. Telling them it was demonic would only further distress them.
Yeah, when you toss out horns,
Yeah.
you kind of get into a zone that's pretty intense.
So now it's about 9:45, and it's a packed house at the Goodens, and there's a huge crowd outside. 4 squad cars, 8 police officers standing watch.
Wow.
2 radio reporters from WNAB showed up then, a Tim Quinn and Bob Pontano, and they asked to speak with Ed Warren. Ed asked Laura for permission first, and she granted it because she knew their show. So Tim interviewed Ed on the porch, and then he went inside, and they were formally introduced to the Gooden family. Apparently, Bob knelt down to the cat, Sam, with his microphone and said,
"Hey, cat, I hear you can talk."
Apparently, wasn't a side splitter. They interviewed and chatted with the family and the Warrens. They were all in the kitchen, and around midnight, they heard a loud bang come from the living room. And they ran in to find that the end table had fallen over. Marcy was in the middle of the living room playing with Sam. See, apparently these 2 radio reporters had come intending to debunk a hoax,
Right.
but they felt the Goodens were being honest. And they even decided maybe not to cover the story at all, deciding it would probably be best left a private family matter. Little Marcy was sitting in a recliner half asleep when suddenly her recliner violently reclined and unreclined. Bob saw it happen and tried to recreate it himself and couldn't. Jerry shouted out to whatever was in the house that,
"We've been good to you. We've given you a home. Now leave us alone. You're a spoiled little child."
It's true, though. It's true. I think that a lot about these motherfuckers. It's like, you are in my house.
Right.
Pay rent, bitch.
yeah, absolutely. Marcy got to her knees, pulled out a little prayer book, started reading from it.
Oh, bless her.
And Jerry just told her to go to bed. So Marcy got up and turned and was walking toward a wall. The spot she was walking toward was about 5 feet from where Lorraine was sitting. Suddenly, Marcy flew backwards like something had thrown her. Her right arm struck the fridge as she flew by it, and then she crashed hard into the wall, hitting her head.
Oh my God.
She landed on the floor in a seated position. Jerry ran to her, and poor Marcy was crying, holding her head.
Oh.
Jerry comforted her, and of course everyone was right there in a flash as well. And that's when Bob looked over at Sam the cat and swears he heard it say, "Help!"
Oh, so is he trying to get help for his friend?
Guess so. Jerry scooped Marcy up in his arms and carried her to the living room. He sat her down in one of the recliners and told her she couldn't fall asleep in case she had a
Yeah.
concussion.
Come on.
So time passed and they took care of Marcy. And the Warrens were out on the porch and other people just milling about the house, chatting, picking up the place the best they could. Suddenly, the recliner that Marcy was in darted backwards, bumping into a table. At the same time, a rush of bitter cold air hit Tim, Jerry, and Lorraine in the kitchen. It was only right there at the table. When they stepped away, the cold wasn't there. Likewise, Bob felt a cold sensation as if something was walking through him. Now, while everyone was experiencing this weird stuff, Bob seemed to be like the target of mischief that night.
Weird.
Obviously, Marcy was the ultimate target, and she was like the target. All the violence was directed toward her, but it seemed like it was just playing with Bob.
Oh, interesting.
There was even a moment involving some coats that had been draped over a stroller near the door, kind of like how you would, drape your coat over a chair if you weren't staying long at a place. Bob watched as the coats hopped off the stroller and just floated in the air a bit. And his daze was broken only by Marcy's scream. She was in the fetal position, and Bob himself was shaken up. He needed to step outside, so he excused himself and went outside, and across the street there were some officers posted up, keeping watch. So he went over and chatted with them a bit about everything. And when he felt good enough, he turned back and went into the house. He goes in, and in the living room, he finds a stack of holy pictures stacked up face down on a little desk of Marcy's. When he walked up to them to get a closer look, they moved. Bob stepped back and watched the desk drawer open as well. So by now, there's so many things happening, it's hard to
It's like everything is happening.
Exactly.
You know?
Now, since stuff was now happening in the living room, like the Warrens suggested, everyone moved to the kitchen. The group chatted in there a bit. Marcy was sitting on one of the dining room chairs, and Jerry stood behind her with his hands on the chair, leaning on it. Suddenly, Jerry went rigid and silent, and he said,
It's here again.
Suddenly, Marcy's chair shot up in the air. Marcy screamed. Jerry jumped back, startled. The chair just floated in the air. Jerry pulled it down, and much like Paul had described, when it got back to the floor, it was like he could feel something release. So it's about 1 a.m. now, when everyone finally leaves. Some other things happened. Bob saw a model airplane move. Ed Warren saw a box of powdered soap in the bathroom just empty itself. So the next day, Tuesday, November 26th, it's a very cold, wet day. So the crowd was not nearly as big as it had been, which was good.
Yeah, that is good.
Officer Mike Costello was parked out front, working crowd control. Jerry called him into the house in a panic, saying that the activity was acting up again. So Officer Costello radioed for some backup, and 2 officers answered, Officers Zawacki and Del Toro. Now, in reality, Del Toro had always been suspicious that this was a hoax.
Oh, okay.
And his boss, Superintendent Walsh, wanted him to wrap this up so they could get on with everything. So the officers arrive and they get caught up on everything. Everyone was in the living room talking, and Officer Costello happened to look over at Marcy and watch as she quietly used her foot to push the TV.
Oh no, Marcy.
It swung around and hit Jerry's leg, startling him, and that's when Marcy noticed that Costello had seen her. She was busted.
Oh no.
Costello called the other officers aside and told them what he saw. And a bit later, Officer Del Toro had a look at that big bureau that kept falling over, and he realized that in the bottom, there was a heavy mirror laying under it that made the bureau very top-heavy. Almost the lightest touch could topple it over. The suspicions that some folks had been harboring were seemingly confirmed. Officer Del Toro then announced to the other officers that Marcy had confessed
Oh, come
to
on.
being behind the chaos. She admitted that she had kicked over the TV and was responsible for making Sam talk. The source says she even showcased how she did it, but I don't know how that's
How could
possible.
she have done that?
Jerry and Laura were mortified. First of all, why was your daughter alone talking to the cops today? That shouldn't have.
No, I get it. It's like, if you're a skeptic and you see
Right.
that makes it seem like, I really understand how that could make it seem
Right.
like this whole thing was fake.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't, she could not have done all of this. She just couldn't have.
So on the one hand, the Jerry and Laura are humiliated and they're angry that Marcy would do that. But at the same time, they know she wasn't responsible for everything.
Exactly, yeah.
But now none of that was going to matter because the word was it was a hoax. Here comes another thing too. When Del Toro asked Marcy about Lorraine Warren's mysterious burn, Marcy said Lorraine put her hand under hot water to produce that effect. Now, that's a can of worms. Ed and Lorraine Warren will get their own episode. Like we said, some people say they're charlatans. Some people said they were legit. You know, who knows? We will do that episode eventually.
We will.
But that's just another interesting point. When pressed if anyone had put Marcy up to this, including her mother, Marcy said no. The officers called the superintendent and informed him that it was all a hoax. The city doctor was then dispatched to inspect Marcy, and it was decided that she was in need of therapy. In the end, what Ed feared would happen was what happened.
Oh, no.
The Warrens were in their car when they heard the police report on the radio. Ed apparently just hit the dashboard in frustration, saying,
"You could hit me over the head with a board, and now I understand what happened to some 15 fantastic cases in our country. When it all gets too bad, it's a hoax."
The haunting did go on for a month or two after that. There's a lot more in the book about more of the usual stuff, you know, TV's moving, all that stuff. An actual scientific investigation was performed. The conclusion was made that there was grounds for legitimate poltergeist activity, but also that Marcy and the Goodens were in need of psychological help, was their determination.
Yeah.
As for this story, it kind of ends here.
Well, so what ended up, it just kind of stopped?
Well, the Goodens tried to sell their home, had trouble couldn't sell the home. I guess they were able to get Marcy back into St. Patrick's, that private school.
Oh, good.
And apparently a lot of it cleared up after that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. This negative energy that she was experiencing was just manifesting.
Right.
If you're a mean kid, if you're a bully, this is your sign to stop doing that.
Absolutely.
Just be kind to everyone. Your words and your actions have consequences that you might not know about.
Absolutely.
But that, I mean, wow. It sucks that Marcy was caught doing that. And it sucks that she was doing that. But at the same time, she was a child.
Yeah.
You know, so you really got to cut her some slack there.
Yeah.
When you start bringing in the public in the press, you lose so much control of what's happening. And it's still happened. You know, like the story is still unfolding.
Right.
Maybe wait until there's some kind of conclusion of some kind.
Exactly.
And then do your book tour.
Exactly.
But it's a bad news. It just complicates everything. Wow. Yeah, this story has it all.
It does.
What a classic spooky haunted house
Incredible story.
poltergeist.
And when I began research, I didn't realize this was going to be a two-parter. I did not realize this one was as in depth as it was.
This should be in the Conjuring universe.
Yeah, I'm sure it will at some time.
Yeah, this is a
will.
Great story.
Absolutely.
Fascinating. I love it.
All right, well, citizens of the Milky Way, that is going to wrap us up for Volume 2 of the Bridgeport Poltergeist.
Dylan, thank you for doing that research and for serving out 2 hot, nasty episodes.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. Of course, if you want to support this show, go to patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast. My name is Dylan Hackworth.
I'm Maureen Bogey.
And this is Creep Street. Good night and goodbye.